Well, good evening here in London. Good morning in California, where Lisa is joining us from. I am Dr. Monica Walker. I'm the engagement manager at the All Operating Theatre Museum at Herb Garrett, and we are so delighted to be able to have Lisa Lane join us tonight. I have a little bit of a blurb about Lisa, just to make sure that we know her before she gets to present her absolutely wonderful kind of experience doing research about, well, you guessed it, us, the All Operating Theatre here in what used to be All St. Thomas's Hospital in London Bridge. Just before I read this intro, just to make it very clear, just some kind of like housekeeping rules. Please keep your camera and microphones off for the duration of the talk. This is going to start with a bit of a presentation. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat room, but because there's going to be very few of us today, there's a big chance that when we get to the Q&A question, we will invite you to just join in the conversation if you feel like it. Turn your camera on, turn your microphone on, and then we'll just further have a lovely talk about everything. For your information, this event is being recorded and it will be available, to rewatch, and for other people to be able to have access to once the event is over. So that being said, please let me just introduce our amazing speaker for today. So Lisa Lane is a historian, a history professor, and an author of several novels, including Before the Time Machine, Murder at All St. Thomas's, the book that we're here for, and Murder at an Exhibition. Now I want to read that one too, Lisa. Come on. She's also engaged in scholarly work about the young H.G. Wells and has published H.G. Wells and Science Education, 1886-1897, and articles in journals like the Wellsian, and is currently engaged in writing the chapter on education for the upcoming Oxford Handbook on Wells. Nice. But her area of expertise and fascination is Victorian England. I totally agree. With a focus on science and technology. In her historical fiction, she likes to explore the tension between the reality of the past and the informed imagination, putting the flesh on the bones of archival research. Yeah, me too. I love that. She's here today to talk about the inspiration for her first Victorian mystery, Murdered at All St. Thomas's. Lisa advertises her books as having a lot of history and a little bit of mystery. That even rhymes. Come on, Lisa. We promise there will be no spoilers if you haven't read the book yet. Like, I'm halfway through, so I do not want to hear any spoilers. But that being said, thank you, Lisa, so much for being here. I think that I'm just going to pass it on to you, because I know that you have a short presentation for us today, just to take us through some of that inspiration and how you basically came up with Murder at All St. Thomas's. And then we'll get into some, good old fashionable conversation. So go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Monica. It's wonderful to be here. I'm Lisa M. Lane. As Monica said, I'm a historian, history professor, and author. I'd like to thank you for coming tonight and ask that you please excuse my accent. I was born in England, but have lived in Southern California most of my life. So you'll hear the Southern California accent tonight. I have recently published a Victorian mystery, Murder at Old St. Thomas's, a book inspired by the old operating theatre and Herb Garrett when they were part of St. Thomas's Hospital. Tonight, I'll talk a little bit about its history and how it connects to my novel. So how did I come to write a novel set in such a place? Well, a number of years ago, I had the pleasure of visiting the old operating theatre and Herb Garrett for the first time. And when I walked into the operating theater, my first thought was, oh, let me do the slide. This looks like a good place for a murder. It's the first thing that came into my head. Now, at the time, I was not yet writing murder mysteries. I was doing research to teach a class in the history of technology and side research on a book about H.G. Wells when he was a science teacher. I also always had a fascination with medical history, and in particular, the history of anesthesia, which I'll talk about a little later. I was thinking of all these things as I viewed the museum, but I kept returning to the operating theater because I could just imagine a body, not down below on the operating table, but in the seats, sitting upright. And over the next year or two, the image kept coming back to me. Who was this body forced to sit upright? And who killed him? On my next visit, I learned more about the operating theater itself and that it was rediscovered in 1956. I wondered why it had been boarded up in the first place. Most of you, I suspect, know the story about how most of the hospital had been destroyed in 1862 to make way for the railway connection to London Bridge and Charing Cross. The St. Thomas's Hospital we have now in Lambeth didn't open until 1871. Where did all the patients go? I learned that the hospital moved to Surrey Gardens and remained there for 9 years. I became even more curious and wanted to know how it was moved, how it was set up in Surrey Gardens. But when I went to do research on it, there was very little about the time that St. Thomas's was located in Surrey Gardens. The narratives about hospital history just skipped that part and jumped right into the building of the new hospital across the river from the Houses of Parliament. 9 years of hospital history being ignored is the sort of temptation that historians just can't resist. And there was a story there, I just knew it, and I began digging into hospital records and searching for images and notes about the hospital during this period. Now, before they moved, this is going back, this is the hospital in 1860. You can see the tower there on the right. This was posted recently by the museum in Instagram as well, this photo. So you can see the tower on the right. You can see in the maps where it was located and the closer map of the hospital layout there at the bottom. The story of the hospital's time in Surrey Gardens turned out to be very interesting. Surrey Gardens had been an entertainment venue since 1831. It featured zoological gardens originally, but people became less interested in caged animals over time, probably because there were so many exhibitions of animals and exotic animals all over Britain. I think people got bored with it. What happened was the music hall, which you can see here in the lower right, became the main attraction of Surrey Gardens. And on the map, for some reason, it's not there, but it's right near the carnivore glass house along the edge of the lake is where it was located. That music hall could hold 10,000 people. In 1856, it was the scene of a tragedy during a religious meeting that was led by the young Reverend Charles Spurgeon. 14,000 people crowded into the hall. Somebody yelled fire, and in the panic, 8 people were crushed to death. But somehow they can't manage to keep hiring it out for concerts and other things. But then there actually was a fire in 1861, and the music hall was completely gutted. By then, the venue wasn't profitable anymore, so instead of restoring it, Surrey Gardens ceased operation completely. Its recent history likely made it a better deal for somebody to buy it or lease it. It didn't have a happy history. The board of the hospital had considered multiple options for relocation. There was a preference for an area south of the river, and Surrey Gardens was chosen despite the difficulty of making the building suitable for a hospital. It was further south than Old St. Thomas's, but well within the industrial area where accidents happened among workers. St. Thomas's patients were mostly from the working classes. A lot of money would be needed to make it happen, but the board decided it was a good temporary location while they looked for a better permanent one. So the large music hall was restored and converted into the main hospital building. The zoological buildings on the grounds were turned into various wards and hospital annexes, including medical lecture rooms and facilities for the Florence Nightingale School of Nurses. The cholera ward was in the old Giraffe House. The grounds were more spread out, of course, than in Southwark, and the staff and patients enjoyed strolling when the weather was good, and then got very annoyed when they had to make a longer walk to get to work when it was raining. So pictures like this from the Illustrated London News, make the accommodations look very nice. Likely they were, but behind the scenes, nurses were complaining that there weren't enough sink basins for washing. There were other inconveniences that made the staff's work more difficult. I can imagine that the array of beds around the rims of the areas that used to be seating for concerts didn't make this easy for them. Because the location was temporary, though, the board was trying to keep expenses to a minimum while still creating a healthful environment. The story of St. Thomas's Hospital overlaps with the extraordinary changes taking place in medicine at the time, many of which I was able to highlight in my mystery. What historical novelists like to do is to take as much factual information as possible, set the story in a historically accurate context, and plausibly invent what remains. The context of medical history in 1862 is full of inventions and changes and disputes, controversies, public debates over hospital administration, over patient care. For example, thanks to Florence Nightingale, ventilation was becoming more popular in hospitals, which made conditions better for both patients and staff. You can see here the windows lined up on the left would have been opened whenever the weather was okay for that, and that would provide ventilation throughout the wards. But there were still some hospital staff who didn't agree with this and wanted to keep patients warm in a stuffy room. At Surrey Gardens, it was difficult to get good ventilation because it's a single large building, so you can really only have the windows open on one side. That'll be remedied, of course, in the new hospital. But every attempt was made to improve it. Now, the hospital being built at this time in Lambeth, and that's the one below, which is the one that we have now, except that the buildings on the left have been removed, and a new hospital building is in its place there, right near the bridge. But it was designed on the ideas of Florence Nightingale and others who wanted ventilation, and that's why it's got these wings where the windows could be open and the space could be cross-ventilated. Ventilation was a goal of St. Thomas's Hospital administration, even when it was hard to achieve in Surrey Gardens Music Hall. And it's funny, it occurred to me that even today with COVID, ventilation is a crucial way to prevent the spread of disease, and yet there's opposition because we've all spent years creating these closed and sealed buildings so that the air conditioning and heating systems will be more efficient and they'll be more weatherproof. And in doing that, unfortunately, we seem to be creating a very unhealthful situation. Now, one of the most extraordinary medical advancements in the mid to late 19th century was anesthesia. This was not without controversy either, even more so than ventilation. There were arguments about this in the medical journals and among ordinary people. Anesthesia was comparatively new in 1862 when my novel takes place. It prevents pain, obviously, for the patient during surgery because they're not conscious. It allows the surgeons more time. It makes possible surgeries that can be deeper within the body and more complex repairs of the body's systems. So it sounds good, but to understand why there was resistance, it's important to know how things were before anesthesia was available. So before anesthesia, a surgeon's speed had long been a source of pride. For example, Edinburgh surgeon Robert Liston was famous for his speed. He could reputedly amputate a leg in under a minute, and he would ask the people watching to time him, to mark his time while he did it. Now, in my novel, Dr. Thaddeus Morton is known for his speed and accuracy, but he also uses anesthesia if he thinks it's appropriate. Now, anesthesia was developed in the 1840s, but only slowly adopted. Ether was highly explosive and smelled terrible, but it was easy to use and it was very hard to overdose a patient with ether. The other option was chloroform. Chloroform was not explosive and it smelled sweet, kind of sickly sweet, but it was very difficult to dose properly. So these differences and discussions about which was better caused a rift among surgeons and a lot of controversy. There were other difficulties in adopting anesthesia because surgeons were accustomed to working on an animate, certainly in pain and screaming and that kind of thing, but somebody who's obviously alive. And when you anesthetize your patient, they kind of seem to be dead already. Now, in my novel, both of the surgeons are appreciative of both the challenges and the usefulness of anesthesia. But the cause of death for my murder victim, this is not a spoiler because this is right at the beginning, is inhalation of too much anesthetic gas. So patients could die from anesthesia, and that's another reason why there was resistance to it. Now, the case of Hannah Greener is a particular example. In 1848, Hannah Greener was an otherwise healthy 15-year-old girl from a village near Newcastle, and she suffered horribly from a version of ingrown toenails that was called onychia maligna. William McCormack of St. Thomas's Hospital believed that this ailment was very common among girls who worked barefoot in the flax mills because their toes got injured a lot because they didn't wear shoes. In fact, Hannah Greener had already undergone surgery for the other big toe, and ether had been used on her successfully. But the second surgery, they used chloroform, and she died. Hers was the first death attributed to the anesthesia that appeared in the medical journals. So in my novel, there's a character who has died from anesthesia during ingrown toenail surgery, and that's a tribute to Hannah Greener. Anesthesia relieved pain, but it did not seem at first to save lives. So this is another reason why it was controversial. Postoperative mortality actually increased in the early years of the use of anesthesia because the problems of sepsis, in particular pyemia and septicemia, had not yet been solved. Because surgeons could take their time and perform these surgeries more deeply in the body, the patient's body cavity was open to the air much longer than it had been, during Liston's 1-minute amputation sort of surgery. So medical experts immediately realized this was likely the cause of the increase in postoperative infection, but they differed as to why leaving the body open for that long was the cause. So some of them thought that there was particulate matter in the air, particles of dirt and dust and smoke that got into the body, and then once you sewed it up, caused problems. But others believe that there were things that naturally occurred in the air that were microscopic elements, like mold or fungi, or what would later be called germs, and that those were getting into the patient. Eventually, that will lead, by the way, to Lister's carbolic spray over the body to try to prevent those things from lodging in the body cavity. But some of these toxic elements, it was argued, could arrive with the surgeons themselves. And this is where James Simpson's work comes in. He had actually published 20 years before this, and he was promoting in Edinburgh the use of hand washing with potassium cyanide, which sounds awful, but it kills germs And it prevented childbed fever, which was his obsession, was this, after childbirth, women would get infected and they would die. And he thought he could prevent this by making sure that the hands that were moving from patient to patient were clean, because he felt that that was what was spreading the disease. He actually tracked it, several cases where one person, one new mother had childbed fever, and then the ones in the beds next to her who had been seen next by the staff of the hospital had all caught it, and others who weren't had not. So he worked on this very hard, and that's why he had everybody washing their hands with this very, very toxic stuff. His ideas then led to the idea that you should separate students in medical school who were working on cadavers. You should make sure that those students weren't the students who were working with live patients, because he also saw the possibility of cross-infection there. So for example, at Surrey Gardens, the dissection room was put in the old Elephant House, because the Elephant House was close to the music hall, but it was very physically quite separate from it. Now, despite his empirical studies and how obvious this might appear to you and me, there were still arguments over the necessity of disinfection and hygiene. Now, conflict, of course, is what novelists just love. So if you read Murder at Old St. Thomas's, you'll notice that when the characters talk about their jobs at the hospital, the conflicts they have with each other, a lot of them are based on these medical controversies of the day, as they would be among the staff. So Dr. Morton, for example, doesn't care about hygiene as much as he cares about the precision of his surgical work. His surgery coat has blood stains and actual encrusted stuff on it, and his assistant notes that he's proud of this. The crusted blood is a tribute to how many patients he's helped with his extraordinary skill and speed. But his assistant knows about the latest in hygiene and finds his surgery coat just disgusting. Medicines, particularly opiates, also feature in my book. One character, the actress Geraldine Orson, there's a whole theater company in the book, has a secret laudanum habit, and the apothecary who manages St. Thomas's Hospital at Surrey Gardens creates special concentrations for her. As Old St. Thomas's is closing, I place this apothecary, Felix Tapper, in the herb garret, packing up his remedies, and then again, running the day-to-day hospital operations at Surrey Gardens. Now, this would have been the job of the apothecary at a hospital. He was an administrator, not just a pharmacist. And he worked closely with the matron, who managed the nursing students and staff. Now, the matron in my book is actually the real-life matron and friend of Florence Nightingale, Sarah Wardroper. So she's heavily based on her, and it is Sarah Wardroper. In addition to showcasing new technologies in medicine, I also wanted my novel to fight common misconceptions about Victorian medicine, which is often portrayed as being ignorant or brutal compared to today's methods, because it's fun to do that. Victorian medical practitioners, however, knew rather a lot about disease and treatment, even if their paradigms of understanding, shall we say, are different from the ones that we have now. They also worked within the scientific methodology of empiricism, as Simpson had, observing what happens along that row of childbirth beds. So their approach was practical as well as theoretical. If a treatment worked, it would gain acceptance, but it might take some time. Publication of findings and professional argument were then, as now, the way to advance medical knowledge. I have characters who are very up to date on the current methods, and others who are more, shall we say, traditional. So were things at Surrey Gardens an improvement over the old location? Now, interestingly, there is some disagreement in the sources even about this. Looking at the hospital records, there seem to have been fewer cases of sepsis at Surrey Gardens. But it's unsure whether that had to do with the location, whether Surrey Gardens was somehow a healthier location than right next to the Thames, or whether it was the increasing popularity of hand washing and ventilation and things like that. Now, amputations, you can see a amputation kit here. Amputations were a sad comment on the danger of industrial work, well, and even daily life in the 1860s. They were more frequent than they should have been. Limbs could be crushed in machines or under the wheels of a cart. In this case, Surrey Gardens definitely seems to have improved the statistics. Amputations resulted in death of the patient less often during the years they were at Surrey Gardens than when they were located in the old location. Now, but again, better hygiene practices were in place. Disinfection was more regularly used at Surrey Gardens than it had been at the old location, even though they had problems with enough sink basins. So again, we don't know whether the new location or the new methods were the most helpful. So I have set much of the novel and the cause of all the action at Old St. Thomas's Hospital right before it was partially destroyed to make way for the railway. There are themes of the old being forced to make way for the new. There are themes about the wondrous new technologies that modernized medicine. And thanks to the museum, I had actual objects in mind as I wrote, including the map of the hospital and the anesthesia equipment that had been on display. In fact, seeing the anesthesia equipment at the old operating theater had me running around finding anesthesia equipment everywhere. And I went to the Society of Anesthesiology. I think it's in Portland Place. And they actually have a museum down in their basement. And I spent some time down there too. Now, of course, the novel does contain Victorian elements other than just medicine. There are groups who want to abolish slave trading. There's an inspector who prefers reading books to talking to people. There's his absurdly tall American sergeant, and there's a group of actors doing Shakespeare for the working classes of Southwark. But it all starts with a murder at Old St. Thomas's right after it closed its doors. And so to give you an idea of the book, I'm going to read the brief prologue because it reflects what I saw on my first visit to the operating theater. The milky glass skylight illuminated the room, casting an afternoon glow over the quiet operating theater. Dust motes floated in the air. The room was large, with a horseshoe-shaped wooden seating area 3 rows deep, each row elevated above the one in front, so medical students could have a perfect view of the surgery below. This made the back row high above the floor, near the skylight that comprised the ceiling. Rails in front of each section provided not only assistance in standing and getting to one's seat on the steep rows, but also something to grip for those who might feel faint during the procedure. Eager students, thirsty for blood or angling for the clearest possible view, always occupied the front row. More squeamish students would sit higher up. But now the old hospital was closed up forever. There would be no more surgeries, no more terrified patients. Below, the double doors from the ward were closed, as was the door at the top of the back row, where students usually entered. The muted sounds of builders hammering and carting bricks along St. Thomas's Street could just be heard. Otherwise, it was silent. The body sat upright in the second row of seats, staring downward. Inside the horseshoe, sawdust usually covered a slotted floor so that blood and fluids could be collected. Now it was bare. In the middle of this area, a rectangular table was situated. Here, patients would be strapped for the procedure. It was this table on which the dead man's gaze was fixed. So I hope I've done justice to the tradition of Old St. Thomas's Hospital, presented a view of its time in Surrey Gardens. My book, of course, can be ordered from your favorite bookshop or purchased online. Monica tells me it's going to be, it's available now, you said, I think, in the online bookshop for the museum, which of course would be the best place to get it. I've got a website here, grassablebooks.com, for all my books. And I want to thank Monica Walker so much for inviting me to talk about my book in connection with the brilliant museum that inspired it. So thanks for listening, and let's talk. Let's have a conversation. I'm going to stop share here. There we go.
That was brilliant.
Oh, I'm
Honestly,
glad you
yeah, thank you so much for bringing that amazing research to the forefront that you did. And you are absolutely right. You know, I've been doing research on All St. Thomas's Hospital for a very long time now.
Yes.
And one of the things that, you know, because our museum basically stops after 1862, you know,
Right.
that's basically what we basically, the story that we tell is the story of All St. Thomas's Hospital from
Yep.
more or less the 12th century, since it was in, you know, London Bridge, all the way to 1862 when it was no longer here. So we try to make that distinction, you know. You are right, like anesthesia literally was used after 1847 until 1862, but we completely skip antiseptics. Like that was 1865 when they started to introduce. We closed down 1862. That's it, you know.
Which means that Surrey Gardens was the place where that stuff started coming in, and that's what interested me.
Yeah, I actually was I was in awe to see that that data that you actually gather about the hospital history after like 1862. There was like a lot of like interesting bits and pieces of history. Where did you start that journey? What were the sources that you use to you know?
Well, I was kind of lucky because the tough thing for a historian doing research is your search terms. So if your search terms are very broad, like you're looking for hospital, 19th century or something like that, you're going to get a whole lot of junk that you can't even use. So Surrey Gardens was such a nice search term because you either got the stuff about it's as an entertainment venue, or you got other things. So what I did was I went to the medical journals, the British medical journals, and I searched through each issue during this Surrey Gardens era. For Surrey Gardens and for Old St. Thomas's Hospital. And I was able to pick out, I don't know, maybe a dozen really good articles just from the medical journals on what was being done at that time at Surrey Gardens. Then I was able to expand that and see what was being done other places at the same time. As Surrey Gardens was open, as the hospital was open at Surrey Gardens. So I had more of a context. And then I went to the Illustrated London News, which liked to showcase new things happening. And that was where I found some of the images, the image of what the music hall looked like when it was the hospital, because it looks quite different from the little pointy turrets and stuff when it was the music hall. And then that one image of the girl in the bed with her family around her was just like, oh, that's so cool, because you can see the window, you can see, you know, that they tried to make it homey. The picture of the ward with the nurse where you can see the gas lights and you can in the windows, and the way that they're using, you know, not everything is standardized. So all the hospital beds don't look the same. People are bringing blankets from home and this kind of thing. That's not usually the picture we have of a hospital. So I was really happy to find a few images.
Oh yeah, no, I can imagine, because I had never seen that image that you showed, and I was like, ooh, that's interesting. I mean, then again, my research stops at 1862, so that puts us
yes, and this is just after.
This is just after, and I'm just like fascinated because you are absolutely right. There's like this laguna of like emptiness in terms of information for that time period. I mean, the history of St. Thomas's Hospital by McGuinness, that she wrote it in the 60s. I think that's the most, it is a great book. It is the most, let's just say that is the most up-to-date research that has been done or written up to date. I mean, in the 60s.
And of course, I wasn't setting out to research the hospital so much as to try to make things as realistic as I could. But as a historian, when you hit a gap, I mean, this is what historians live on. This is what history PhDs are made of, right? Is you find a gap where nobody's done it, where there there should be sources,
Mhm.
but nobody's worked with it. There are no secondary articles. There are no historians working on it. And I did not expect to find a historical gap when I started researching.
Mm. Are you
But
going to
there
be?
it was. And so then you got to dive in and start digging. So the other thing that was really helpful is Google has digitized a lot of the St. Thomas's Hospital records. And that was
Yes.
absolutely crucial, was to go through those and look at the little charts and the little numbers, because they kept track of everything,
Mhm.
who entered the hospital, what they had wrong with them, how long they stayed, which was
Yeah.
really shocking to me. I couldn't believe the length of the hospital stays at this time, that somebody who broke an ankle, for example, would be in the hospital for 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And I'm going, boy, nowadays you'd go to the place and they'd wrap up your ankle and they'd hand you a prescription, a script for something, and you go home.
Yeah, I think that the longest in St. Thomas's, like all St. Thomas's, that you can stay in the hospital for was 3 months. And if after 3 months you have not been cured, you were considered to be incurable and kicked out of the hospital, because at that point somebody could use your bed. That is actually
Yeah,
curable.
right. And now it's more like 3 hours.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, go home and take care of it. Hope you got somebody to help you there, because that's what it made me think. It made me think that people are staying because they can't leave, because no one can care for them. They don't
Yeah.
have anybody to care for them. If you've got these lower class
Yeah.
patients who are at the hospital and you send them home, you patch them up and send them home, they would die not just of infection, but just of having nobody to help them,
Yeah, no,
nobody to feed them,
it's quite a horrible kind of picture, because even if you think about the fact that we're dealing with the working class in general,
Yeah.
men and women, that have to go through some of these kind of like surgical procedures. I mean, can you imagine if suddenly, let's just say, we have the case of Elizabeth Reagan, who was a 60-year-old woman who had to had her leg amputated. Unfortunately she did die 3 days later from massive infection. uh, but if she had survived as an older woman, if she had had no family to support her,
Right.
you can't work. You have to depend on the charity of others. Your
Mhm.
prospects of, or your life expectancy, even after leaving the
Mhm.
hospital, even after saving your life, would have been even low, because you will find yourself in a certain position, but after you leave the hospital with this kind of disability, that you lost your leg or you lost your arm, which makes you potentially incapable of working,
Right.
you are bound to a level of poverty, that will end up killing you in the end.
And everybody knew that. It's interesting. I was just doing research for a completely different book, and I was looking at records of the Old Bailey.
Mhm. Oh yeah.
And I was looking at a court case where a woman who had 2 children and a husband, and they were all living in a very small accommodation in London. She had been to the hospital and she had come home, and the husband was just derelict. He was a drunk. He hadn't made any money for years. She'd been making all the money. The daughters didn't know what to do to help. One of them had children of her own, and the woman died, and the court was trying to decide whether the husband was culpable because he didn't care for her after she came home from the hospital. And I didn't expect to stumble on that. I was looking for something else entirely, but it was a really interesting case because it meant that everybody was aware that there was an expectation that once you left the hospital, you would have family and people or neighbors or something to take care of you, and that so many people didn't.
Yeah, and that's the harsh reality of the Victorian era during the Industrial Revolution.
And
This
she didn't die of sepsis. She died of starvation.
that is
She
horrible.
starved to death in her own home.
Wow. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just, and that's the kind of picture that we're painting here, in the hospital. I mean, in your book, I mean, like I said, I'm halfway through it, and already some of the things that you are, presenting and putting together are harsh, because that's the truth of the time period, in that respect. So yeah, are you planning on writing an article or an academic kind of like more center thing about that time period when Surrey Gardens was St. Thomas's?
I could, but I'm not planning on doing it. The what's turning into sort of a series, I'm calling it a semi-series of
Okay.
semi-cozy mysteries, because what happened with Murder at Old St. Thomas's is that the second one that I've written, Murder at an Exhibition, which yes, you should read because of art, it's an art history mystery. Yeah, it's all based around the National Gallery. That one ends up having a completely different focus, where I had to do a completely different kind of research. And now the third one that I'm editing now, Murder on the Pneumatic Railway, again, has a different focus. I don't think I'll get back to Surrey Gardens because I'm still working on H.G. Wells to try to.
Okay, fine.
Really,
H.G. Wells is
H.G. Wells,
cool.
but not H.G. Wells, not H.G. Wells, the author. I don't care about that. H.G. Wells, when he was younger, he didn't write before the time machine until he was 26. So like, what was he doing? Well, what he was doing was teaching science. And that's the part I'm actually, and so it's actually the Victorian portion of his life that I'm interested in.
That is interesting. The
one
that
I
is
don't
connected
think I'll
with
get
science.
That too.
You're just killing me. I was like, I want your research.
I just put it all in there, and I do have rather extensive, there's more extensive author notes for this book, and I put a bibliography in the back, which is, I know, really unusual for a novel, but
I appreciate it.
Yeah, if people wanted to pursue this, if any aspect of it interested them, I want them to have my sources.
I mean, one of the good things that we're working on, I mean, and this is like, completely not about the book, but one of the things that we're working on is that we really want to get sorted is putting together a research fellowship between King's College and the museum, to basically dig deeper into the stories of patients, and kind of like bring about these, this idea of class, gender, and race that you have here in All St. Thomas's Hospital, and how it's all kind of like connected with healthcare and medicine in the time period. So it's kind of like a really interesting, it's that part of the research that is really fascinated. So I'm gonna invite I think that we've got someone. I hope this is you, Kathy. That is part.
She disappeared.
Wow.
She vanished.
She disappeared.
Don't call on me. Don't call on me. Yeah.
It's like, don't call on me. I was going to invite her to kind of like ask questions, but then suddenly she just left. I mean, it's fine, because this just pretty much means that we get to continue to have this conversation.
We do, and this is recorded, which means that anyone can watch it later on. So that's great.
Absolutely, that's the idea. Because I find the whole process like really fascinating. I mean, the process that you went through. I mean, when you sat down, decided that this is going to be my novel, because you did much more research than just focusing on the history of the hospital. I mean, there is the whole theatrical kind of world of Sadak and that kind of like aspect. How did you prepare for that one? I mean,
well, I used to work in theater, so I have an affinity. I was a lighting designer for a while, and I've done all the backstage jobs. So I sort of have an affinity to theater anyway, as part of my life. But the operating theater, that concept, we don't really think operating theater. When we hear the word theater, we think of performance, plays and concerts, that kind of thing. So I thought it would be interesting to have a double theater, to have the operating theater and to have a theater that was doing performances. So that was my first idea, was to bring in a theater group that could do it. But yes, I did a lot of research in that area, particularly the just that region of Southwark that had this theater. And then I wanted to create people who could be part of the hospital mystery, because hospitals needed funding, particularly hospitals like St. Thomas's. And if they didn't have a huge endowment, they needed funding. So they needed to have a lot of fundraising activities. And they did with various concert halls and theaters and art galleries. They would have these benefit galas just like they do now to try to raise money for things that were happening or for expansion or sometimes even just for basic operating expenses. So it made sense to have a theater gala happen for the benefit of the hospital where the two theaters
And I like
could
that.
could meet and mix and the two stories could become intertwined. So the theater research was easier in a lot of ways than the hospital research and the research of the area, because I'm very much into maps and how long it would take in those times for people to get from here to there and how they would travel around the city.
Yeah.
Because my interest is technology, so I'm interested in the sewers and the railways and all of that infrastructure. But the funny thing about my writing process, and I don't recommend this, you know, should anybody be a writer watching this and say, ooh, careful, because apparently there's two kinds of writing. I've learned this rather recently. There's plotters who like outline the entire thing and do all their research ahead of time. And then there's pantsers who work by the seat of their pants and they kind of pick up things as they go along. And I'm afraid I'm one of those. I literally just sat down with that body in the theater, in the prologue, and started writing. And then when I get to a place, which happened all the time, very quickly, where I needed to know more, I would stop writing and do the research.
Yeah.
Then I'd find everything I needed to know, and then I'd go back, take notes, and then go back and continue the story. And I'm afraid I did that all the way through the book, and they tell you absolutely do not do that. You should outline in advance and know where your story is going. I did not know who the killer was most of the book. So you're halfway through.
Halfway through. Yeah.
Okay. And it's like,
I have no idea what
was I. Neither did I.
It's like, okay, is there like any like red herring, you know, that I'm missing, you know?
They're there.
Like,
they're there. And yeah, and the red herrings, I'm afraid, are quite believable because when I was writing them, that's who I thought
I
might have
mean,
done it.
that in its way, it's kind of like really cool, right? I mean, you know, I always feel like when I dabble, I've done short stories and things like that,
Oh, good
and
for you.
yeah, and I have kind of like a very similar experience. I am definitely not a plotter, which of course makes writing a full novel that much more like harrowing. It's like, oh my God, you know, I can never write like something so long. Give me something short and let me tell you this bit of the story and I'm more or less okay. But ask me to actually plot all of this stuff and yeah,
I've tried it now twice because I felt bad when I finished Murder at Old St. Thomas's and I went to the next one. I thought, I've got to map this out. That was crazy. It worked and I love it, but it was nuts. And no, I ended up doing the same thing.
I mean, if it's your process, then it's your process. I know that it might not be the fastest one, you know.
I don't know. The characters are the key. The characters become very real to me. And Inspector Slaughter and his wife were very real to me. And I could see Mark Honeycutt with his extraordinary height trying to get into all the vehicles of the time. And I could see these people. And of course, with Sarah Wardrop, where I have a picture, I have a photograph. She was a real person.
Yeah.
And so I can look at them and say, I can kind of tell, you know, you can tell from people the lines on their face and especially when they're older, as she was much older when she became matron.
I mean, even her life was so sad.
And her life was extraordinary. And you can see it in her face.
Yeah.
You can see the pain. So I love the Victorian era because we do have the drawings, we do have the photographs.
Yeah.
And we can actually look at the people that we're writing about. I didn't start as a Victorianist. My training is that I was a medievalist.
Me too.
Okay. I studied medieval technology. That was what I did.
Medieval art history.
Okay. Yeah. Medieval technology, all the sources were archaeological, which is great, but it's very difficult to create a story. You really have to be in a fictional mindset. And I need the facts. I want the facts of what it was really like. I want to time travel back and be there.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do that with the, I know people do it beautifully with the medieval era, but I couldn't do it.
I mean, it's
I
not the
needed
same
to be where
thing.
there was
Yeah.
stuff I understood going on.
Yeah, no, I can imagine because yeah, it's a lot harder when you have less information. You can use your imagination, obviously, but
Absolutely.
you are right. I mean, one of the fascinating things that we have, for example, I don't know if you, yeah, probably not, you didn't encounter Hampton Weeks, you know, in your research, but Hampton Weeks was one of our students in St. Thomas's, and he kept writing letters to his father, and
Oh,
those letters were kind of like preserved, and he was talking about his experience as a student here in St. Thomas's Hospital in the early 19th century. And there is this wonderful quality of being able to read,
yes.
you know, this first account. It feels a bit intrusive and a bit voyeuristic, like, let's be honest, because it's just like, okay, I'm reading someone else's mail, you know? But it also makes people be that much more real, you know. Like there was this little bit of information where he was basically, you know, his father, because you also have all of the responses, right? The father telling him, you know, this is the last money that I'm sending you, you're wasting your money in parties and this is it, you know. And it's like, wow, you know, parenthood has not changed much, has it? Throughout
No,
time.
and it tells you, you know, when people write about don't do this, don't do that. Well, that tells you what they were doing.
That they were, yeah, oh, absolutely. And I think that that is really fascinating because the hospital had all these rules about do not get drunk, do not play, you know, card games or
Oh,
dice
yes.
games, do not fraternize with the opposite sex. And it's like a
It's so
constant
true.
thing.
Right? There's no reason, and I tell my students this, right? There's no reason to have a rule against something if
If it's
people
not
aren't doing it.
happening. Yeah,
Right.
it absolutely. And it's really fascinating when you start like thinking about that. But yeah, there is something really wonderful when you actually get to hear their voices, you know, even when you read the reports from the surgeons, you know, and the physicians about the case studies that they do,
Yeah.
you know, how they meticulously analyze, well, this is the person, this is what happened, this is what they told us, this is what we decided to treat them on this day, this happened, this is how they felt, blah blah blah, and then they just go right into detail. Well, this is the diagnosis, this is how it progressed, this is the reasoning behind it, you know. And you hear the voices, you know, more actively of the medical practitioners, but in there amongst the answers is
Yes.
also the voice of the patient, you know. And it's so fascinating to try to place yourself in that position. And the fact that the Victorian era has all of this additional kind of information that
So
makes
much.
it so much more vivid, you know, for us. That I don't know why we still have this fascination with the Victorian era. You know, it's a time period full of really wonderful things. At the same time, there's a time period full of like horrible things, you know.
Right. And now's the time to be looking at it
Yeah.
because we're living in a time now that is so similar in so many ways. We've got the same fixation on gadgetry.
Yeah.
We've got the same faith that technology, if we could just figure out how to make it work, it's going to fix everything.
Yeah.
We have that same sort of fear of those things getting out of control
Hmm.
that the Victorians had. It's such a similar time right now. How fast the
Interesting.
inventions move,
Yeah.
how fast the medicine, scientific medicine moves. It's all so similar to the Victorian, particularly the mid to late Victorian era, as what we deal with now, that we can feel a real affinity
Yeah.
when we read about these things happening. There's a lot in my novel. There's sort of a subtext of commentary about now, about how we do things now, that kind of runs through the book. And I think if you're writing about the Victorian era,
Yeah.
that's so natural that that would happen. We have so much in common. It's a
Yeah.
great time to study it.
I mean, I know that this is pushing it in me. I think it's still the Victorian era, you know. Is it Spanish flu when it hit in the early
That's the big Spanish flu is right at the end of
oh
the First World War. So we're talking 1918, 19. And I
yeah,
was there when COVID started, I started researching the Spanish flu
yeah.
because it looked to me like the very similar model. And if you actually track the first 2 years of COVID
Yeah.
along the waves that came, they're almost identical
Yeah.
to the Spanish influenza waves
Yeah.
between 1918 and 1920. And the public response in 1920, when everybody had it with quarantines, had it with the masks, had it with everything. And in 1920, the newspapers stopped covering the flu. Nobody wanted to hear about it anymore. And they had a really bad wave. And nobody reported it. And a whole bunch of people died and they didn't report it. And that was the last big wave of Spanish influenza, was in 1920. When I learned about Spanish influenza, they said it was 1918 to 1919.
Yeah. Nope.
The sources didn't
1920.
want to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, no,
Geez,
I mean, I wonder why.
it somehow sounds familiar. It's a great time to study Spanish flu.
I
It's also
mean,
a great time to study smallpox inoculation.
yeah,
This is Victorian,
yeah,
because the smallpox inoculation, they could not get people to inoculate. They could not get people, the vaccine had been around since the 18th century, but they couldn't get everybody to use it. And it took many ways before Parliament mandated.
yeah,
Everybody had, there were no exceptions.
yeah,
Everybody had to
to
be
have it
inoculated against
inoculated.
smallpox. And when they did that, it finally ended it.
Yeah,
I had thought we were doing Spanish flu, but now I'm a little worried we're doing smallpox.
smallpox. Well, true story. All St. Thomas's Hospital was the first
Hmm.
hospital in London to actually start taking gender seriously and delivering vaccines to the lower classes. So
Yeah. See, and you have to, but if you don't, again, if you don't mandate
yeah.
it,
No,
people
that
don't.
I mean, people were actually, if you see the I don't know if you saw the newspaper clippings and a lot of the different images that came out of it of about like anti-vaxxers in that time
Yeah,
period, and
absolutely.
the rhetoric is very much the same today, which is like really fascinating in my mind, because it's like it shows us like how much how far we've come and how little we've really advanced in some areas.
Well, that's a good way to put it. I like that. You should put that on a t-shirt. How far we've come, but how little we have advanced.
Yeah, it's
That's
kind of,
good.
it's just it's kind of like I think that there's like some element of catching up, but
There is. And it's
oh
interesting because reading back, you think everything's now, it's all happening now, and you can read back. History does not repeat itself. I think it was Mark Twain who said this, but
yeah,
it rhymes.
it rhymes. Oh, I
And
like
yeah,
that.
I think that's Mark Twain. I
Yeah,
think it's Mark Twain. History does not repeat itself, but it
it
rhymes. And so you
rhymes.
don't have the exact same thing happening again, but you do have certain characteristics and themes that come through that might be useful if they were studied and publicized. So I noticed the magazines and journals were writing more about Spanish influenza
Yeah.
when COVID started. So it is interesting that there's lessons to be learned, even if it's not exactly repeating.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that that's one of the beautiful aspects of the All Operating Theatre Museum at Herb Garrett. It's kind of like
Yeah.
this space to reflect on that kind of like, medical history that seems to be making leaps in your surgeon doesn't even have to be in the room. It can be in Australia and doing surgery in New York. Why?
Yeah.
Because,
They-
computers. And I just find that like mind blowing. And then thinking about how everything was in the past, and now thinking about how in 200 years from now, what people are going to say about our time, if there's still a human race around. Sorry, that was very dark and very, very pessimistic.
It's okay. I think it was William Faulkner who said the past isn't gone, it's not even past.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's still very much with us. And
it
the
is.
herb garret, I felt like I didn't have enough room in this novel to get into what your herb garret does, which is with the curation of the herb garret, at least when I was there, was wonderful in showing what all of the herbs could do and what they were all used for.
Yeah,
And the Chelsea Physic Garden
yeah,
has a lot of that also. And I'd like to someday, you're talking about, what would I do next? I would like to deal with some of this botanical history of what was used for what sort of illnesses.
yeah.
Because we have this idea that modern pharmaceuticals are better, but in some cases, that's not true at all. And that the thing about herbs is they could have so many different
Yeah.
things that they could help at the same time.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that sometimes we actually forget that all of these fancy pharmaceutical companies, most of the active ingredients do come from plants.
From plants,
You
exactly.
know, you're mixing
And
them
they,
up with other things, you
yeah,
know, but there aren't that many synthetic kind of like compounds, are
yeah.
they? You know,
And they tend to
these
pull
are
stuff out.
still, yeah, exactly. I mean, this is basically what you're taking with pills. It's just kind of like a condensed kind of like version of a herbal remedy in a way,
Right,
you know.
right. And it's very interesting to go back to the original
Yeah,
herb and see what else, what was taken out of it to make the modern pharmaceutical,
yeah.
what was removed, and whether what was removed would help in other ways.
Well, that's part of the of our story,
I know, it's
and you know,
fascinating.
well, that's the early story. We've recently discovered that there was a really big chance that the herb garret, when it was turning to the operating theater was introduced, the herb garret disappeared, and what is now the herb garret was turning to a post-op ward
Right,
for
that would make
patients,
perfect sense.
you
Yeah.
know, which makes a lot more sense in some cases. So there've been a couple of like kind of like comments here and there that seems to indicate that that was the case. But I mean, the herb garret was used for 100 years by the apothecaries, you know, precisely to make all of these medicines. And
Oh yeah, well, and
it's
it makes
just,
sense. It makes sense because you've got
yeah,
ventilation. You've got ventilation up there,
yeah,
high up enough to keep all the herbs from getting moldy.
yeah,
You know,
exactly. So it's just like
great space.
brilliant. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it's a great
So
space. So
it's
I'd like to do something with that.
oh, I'm not surprised. Please do, you
Someday,
know.
yeah.
So like, please do, because it's one of those things that it's still really fascinating. And next year we're dedicating the entire year to herbal remedies,
Oh, good.
apothecaries, and pharmacy. So we're doing the whole history of it on
Excellent.
our events program in Korean, like our virtual events program. So hopefully, you
Good.
know, if anybody's still listening to this, you know, join
I
us
love it.
in. But
I love it.
we're out of time. I
Sure.
just really want to thank you, Lisa, for man, it's just been lovely, and it's been so chilled, and it's just been so
Yeah,
nice to, you
fun.
know, I love everything that you brought into the mix. You know, the research, the history, the conversation, it's just been fabulous.
Oh, that's great.
So
That's great.
thank you so
Well, thank
much.
you. Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm glad. So I will send you a link to this. So if you want to, you
Oh,
know.
sure. Thank you. I'd appreciate that. Yes, absolutely.
Well,
That'd be great.
apparently you bought a ticket, so you will get it anyway.
That's true. I did buy a ticket. Thank you.
No, thank you.
And
So
I'm so happy you guys are doing the skylight, and I know it means that you have to close for a while, and that's sad, but I'm so glad because I spend a lot of time with that skylight, I feel like.
so please, like when you come in this summer,
I
you're
will.
coming in May, you said.
I hope
So
so.
then let me know, because I'll give you a private tour of the museum again, you know.
Yay.
But I know that you know everything about it now, so it's like I don't think that it's going to be
That's
private, but I
wonderful.
will be interested to hear your thoughts about or additions to the space.
Oh yeah, I want to see the light.
We've got a door now as well, where the
Nice.
old door used to be. So
Oh, I love it. I love it that what you guys are doing. The work is just amazing.
we're just trying our best to preserve something that is worth preserving and interpreting
Wonderful.
for future
Very
generations.
important.
So it's also a privilege to do that. So anyway, thank you so much. Have a lovely
Good. Thank
day.
you.
I'm off
Thank
home
you.
now.
Take
So
care.
bye, you too.
Bye-bye.